Mons, Belgium, August 23, 1914. A German infantry regiment advances toward the Mons-Condé Canal. They advance as if across a parade ground, dressed for a conventional engagement against a conventional enemy. Their doctrine is sound, their numbers are overwhelming. 3 German soldiers for every British one. The Lee-Enfield is already in the hands of the men waiting for them. What followed, by the Germans' own accounts, made no sense. Their soldiers reported machine guns, multiple positions, a sustained rate of fire that no bolt-action rifle force could possibly produce. They pulled back, regrouped, tried to calculate where the guns were, but much of that fire was not machine guns. A British soldier, armed with the short-magazine Lee-Enfield Mark III, could place 15 aimed rounds per minute into a target at 300 yards. A platoon of 30 men firing at that rate generated 450 rounds a minute, approaching in raw volume the output of a machine gun of the period. The Germans had prepared for infantry. They received something their doctrine had no category for. The regiment that walked into the canal-side positions that morning did not walk back out as it had arrived, and the rifle that broke their advance had already been marked for replacement. That is the dark reason it is still in service. The Lee-Enfield was born from institutional embarrassment. During the Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, British infantry discovered what their standard rifle actually was. The magazine Lee-Enfield Mark I, issued from 1895, fired a .303 British cartridge with a round-nosed bullet at relatively low muzzle velocity. Against Boer marksmen armed with the 7x57mm Mauser, a round with a flatter trajectory, higher velocity, and significantly better long-range performance on the open veldt, the British were outshot at distances their own weapon handled poorly. The problem was not simply the cartridge, it was the system. The existing rifle was designed for controlled, deliberate fire, the volley-firing doctrine of a previous era. The Boers did not cooperate with that doctrine. They engaged at range, from concealment, and withdrew before weight of numbers could tell. The British Lee-Enfield soldier had no answer to this, because the rifle's design had not asked him to provide one. The War Office response, arriving on January 1, 1904, was the short magazine Lee-Enfield Mark I. And by January 26, 1907, the definitive SMLE Mark III. It weighed 8.8 pounds, fed from a detachable 10-round box magazine loaded via 2 5-round charger clips, and its chamber was built to accept a new pointed Spitzer loading, the Mark VII cartridge, formally adopted in 1910. The bolt ran on rear-locking lugs, which made it faster to operate than the Mauser pattern cock-on-opening designs used by Germany, because the soldier did not need to overcome the full resistance of the firing mechanism on the opening stroke. The Hythe School of Musketry codified what this speed meant in practice. The formal requirement, the mad minute exercise, practice 22 from the 1909 musketry regulations, was 15 hits on a target at 300 yards within 60 seconds. Trained men often exceeded 30. In 1914, Sergeant Instructor Snoxall is reported to have placed 38 rounds into a 12-inch target in a single minute. The rifle was designed not just to fire accurately, but to sustain that accuracy under the pressure of rapid-fire conditions. The War Office had solved the Boer problem. They had, without fully intending it, built something whose real capabilities would only become visible when an enemy tried to understand why their doctrine was failing. Germany went to war in 1914 with a coherent theory of infantry combat. The Gewehr 98 was their instrument, a Mauser pattern bolt action, cock-on opening, fed from a 5-round internal magazine. It was accurate at long range. Its 7.92 by 57mm cartridge was powerful. By the standards of any arms evaluation of the period, it was a credible competitor to the SMLE and, on pure ballistic grounds, superior at extended range. German infantry doctrine built from this. A rifle was a precision instrument. Volume of fire was the role of machine guns. The MG-08 which the Germans deployed in considerably greater numbers per division than the British. The individual soldier's rifle was for aimed, deliberate engagement, not sustained rapid fire. This was not an irrational position. It reflected how the Gewehr 98 actually performed and how German musketry training was organised. A Gewehr 98 soldier working a cock-on opening bolt and reloading from a 5-round internal magazine simply could not produce 15 aimed rounds per minute in the way a trained SMLE rifleman could. The Germans knew this. They did not consider it a weakness because their doctrine had not assigned that role to the rifle. They had not planned for a war in which it would matter. At Mons, on 23rd August 1914, that planning met the British Expeditionary Force. The BEF was, at that moment, the product of years of musketry reform driven by the Boer experience. Every other rank was expected to engage targets rapidly and consistently. Sections of 8 men drilled on the rapid-fire exercises until the bolt stroke required no deliberate thought, the round already chambered before the front sight had settled. The result, as German survivors documented in after-action accounts and later in regimental histories, was a volume of aimed fire that their pre-war planning had categorised as impossible from a bolt-action force. They reported machine guns in positions where none were found. German regimental accounts described positions held by forces considerably larger than those that subsequent British records showed were actually present, because the rate of fire from 8 men suggested a crew-served weapon, not a rifle section. The Mark III's bolt design was the mechanical reason. Because it cocked on closing rather than on opening, the rifleman's thumb could ride the bolt without fighting the striker spring. The bolt handle sat close to the trigger hand, over the trigger group, rather than at the front of the action, as on the Mauser. An experienced soldier could cycle the bolt without moving his cheek from the stock, maintaining his sight picture, and fire again. The 10-round magazine meant half the reload stops of a German soldier at the same volume of fire. What the German accounts from Mons describe is not a rifle that was better in some abstract sense. They describe a system that could perform, in a rifleman's hands, at a tempo their doctrine had reserved for crew-served weapons. The dark reason the Lee-Enfield is still in service is not that it was never beaten. It is that every attempt to replace it was defeated, not by the rifle, but by the replacement. By 1945, the War Office knew what it wanted. The war had confirmed what the Germans had demonstrated with the Sturmgewehr 44. The future of infantry weapons was an intermediate cartridge, something between a pistol round and a full-power rifle round, delivering controlled, automatic fire at realistic combat ranges. A new design team at the Royal Small Arms Factory, Enfield, went to work. By 1951, they had produced the EM2, a bullpup assault rifle chambered in the purpose-built .280 British cartridge, shorter and lighter than anything then in service, with an integrated optical sight. The War Office adopted it on 25th of April 1951 as the Rifle Automatic Caliber .280 No. 9. Roughly 50 were manufactured. Winston Churchill's incoming government cancelled the programme. The reason, formally, was NATO standardisation. The United States would not accept the .280 British round. At a series of trials conducted at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in 1951, the Americans declared the British cartridge underpowered. The British declared the American 7.62 by 51mm NATO round too powerful for controlled automatic fire in a rifle, a position that subsequent NATO experience would, in time, confirm. Neither side yielded. Canada declared they would adopt the British round, but only if the United States did likewise. It was clear they would not. Churchill concluded that alliance cohesion outweighed any qualities the EM2 possessed. He also, by some accounts, harboured a personal scepticism about automatic rifles encouraging soldiers to waste ammunition. The rifle was cancelled. No production line was ever established. Britain adopted the FNFAL as the L1A1 self-loading rifle in 7.62 by 51mm NATO, a weapon the EM2 had demonstrably outperformed in the same trials. and the Lee-Enfield No. 4 remained as the standard infantry rifle until 1957. The EM2's designer, a Polish officer named Kazimierz Januszewski, who had taken the assumed name Stefan Janssen and worked from a bench at the Royal Small Arms Factory, saw the project cancelled whilst the rifle he had built was still demonstrably the best available option. NATO, decades later, moved to the 5.56 by 45mm intermediate cartridge, almost exactly the conclusion the British 280 programme had reached in 1945. The procurement system had rather different plans for what came next. But what came next in practice was that the Lee-Enfield action was not finished. When the L1A1 entered service, it became apparent that it was not suited to the sniping role. The semi-automatic mechanism introduced inconsistencies that a bolt action could not. The solution the Ministry of Supply arrived at was to take existing Lee-Enfield No. 4 Mark 1T sniper rifles, rechambered to 7.62 by 51mm NATO, and redesignate them. They entered service in 1970 as the L42A1. An action designed by James Paris Lee in the 1880s, firing a cartridge adopted in the 1950s, issued to British Army snipers in 1970. The rifle the War Office had been trying to replace for 60 years refused to be replaced. The L42A1 served in Darfur. It served through the troubles in Northern Ireland. It went south to the Falklands in 1982. The Falklands, specifically, is where the arithmetic became clear. British snipers, operating in the South Atlantic, required a weapon that would function reliably at extended range in cold, wet, salt-laden conditions. The L42A1 performed. When the conflict ended, the Ministry of Defence commissioned a proper replacement, and the trials that followed produced the Accuracy International L96A1, adopted formally in 1985. The Lee-Enfield action left British Army service, except in Afghanistan. The CIA's Operation Cyclone, running from 1980, provided Lee-Enfield rifles to the Afghan Mujahideen. No. 4 Mark I variants, some manufactured at the Long Branch factory in Canada during the Second World War, supplied through Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate. Those rifles did not disappear when the Soviet withdrawal completed in 1989. They remained in Afghanistan. British and American troops operating in Helmand and Kandahar in the 2000s documented Lee-Enfield rifles among weapons caches recovered from Taliban positions. Some carried British-manufactured .303 ammunition, dated to the 1940s. By the later years of the campaign, reporting from the region documented Taliban fighters using these bolt-action rifles with markedly improved accuracy. A bolt-action rifle designed around the lessons of the Boer War, in service in the opening years of the 21st century, firing ammunition older than the men aiming it. In India, the rifle factory Ishapur produced a 7.62 by 51mm NATO version of the Mark III receiver, the Rifle 2A and 2A1, from 1962 until the mid-1970s. Lee-Enfield pattern rifles have remained in police, reserve, ceremonial or local security use across parts of South Asia. Pakistan ordnance factories, which acquired machinery from the Royal Ordnance Factory at Fazakali when British production ended in 1956, continued to manufacture Lee-Enfield pattern rifles for decades under their own authority. In the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa region, workshops in Dara Adam Khel produce working copies of the Lee-Enfield action to this day, chambered in the original .303 British and in several other calibers. 17 million Lee-Enfields were produced across factories in Britain, Canada, Australia, India, and the United States during the rifle's official production life. The number in circulation since, counting conversions, inherited stocks, and local copies, has never been fully accounted for. The EM2 is in a museum in Leeds. The L1A1 is a collector's piece. The Lee-Enfield is in a gunsmith workshop in the hills above Peshawar. Military institutions plan for the war they expect to fight. They design their equipment around that expectation, conduct their trials in conditions that confirm it, and adopt the weapons that perform best against their own assumptions. The EM2 was, by any technical measure, the correct answer to the infantry weapon question of 1951. Lighter than what it replaced, chambered for a round suited to the ranges at which infantry actually engaged, and capable of controlled automatic fire without the recoil penalties that the NATO round would later impose on everyone who adopted it. The EM2 had every argument on its side. The Americans who blocked it knew none of this yet. Neither, in the end, did Churchill. What the Lee-Enfield's history exposes is not that the procurement system failed, though it did. It is that the weapons which survive their own obituaries are the ones whose essential qualities, speed, reliability, a tolerance for the conditions soldiers actually operate in, rather than the conditions planners imagine, are embedded deeply enough that no replacement can simply legislate them away. The Boers forced a redesign. The redesign produced something that operated like a machine gun in a rifleman's hands. That thing survived every attempt to bury it for the better part of a century, not because the men in the War Office were wrong, but because the men in the field knew something that the officers in Whitehall did not. The EM2 was right on the evidence. The Lee-Enfield was right on the ground. Between those two things, the evidence available to planners and the reality available to soldiers, lies the full history of why armies carry what they carry, long after anyone intended them to. No deliberate decision kept the Lee-Enfield alive. It survived because every decision to remove it kept failing, and the rifle itself kept working. Institutions forget. Rifles don't. If this series on British military history is something you'd like to see more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next video examines a weapon the War Office was so certain it had right, it went to war twice before admitting otherwise.